Saipan, June 1944. Corporal James McKenna crouched behind a coral outcropping 30 yards from a Japanese bunker, his M1 Garand pressed against his shoulder, and tried to calculate whether the ammunition he had just been issued could do what the supplies sergeant claimed it could do. The bunker was built into the side of a hillside, reinforced with coconut logs stacked 3 deep, packed earth, and sheets of corrugated steel salvaged from destroyed buildings. It had firing slits barely wide enough for a rifle barrel, and it commanded the only approach to the high ground where McKenna's company needed to be before nightfall. Standard .30-06 Springfield rounds bounced off the logs, chipped the coral, did nothing. Bazookas were in short supply. Flamethrowers had not yet arrived. Artillery was unavailable because forward observers could not get a clear line of sight. So McKenna and his squad were stuck, pinned down, taking sporadic rifle fire from the bunker and from spider holes they could not see, and the sun was dropping fast. Then the sergeant had crawled up with a bandolier of ammunition, handed it to McKenna, and said these were M2 armor-piercing high-velocity rounds, designed for anti-tank use, but effective against fortifications, and that if McKenna put them through the firing slit or through the logs themselves, the bunker would not be a problem anymore. McKenna loaded 8 rounds into his Garand, flipped off the safety, and aimed at the center log. 6 inches left of the firing slit. He fired. The log exploded inward. He fired again. The second log splintered. He fired a third time, and the round punched clean through all 3 logs and detonated something inside the bunker, because there was a flash, a muffled explosion, and then silence. The Japanese called it Heki no Toppa, wall breaker. If this story moved your heart even once, subscribe. It's the least tribute we can give to men like him. James McKenna was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, in 1921, the second son of a steel worker who died in a foundry accident when James was 11. His mother worked as a seamstress, long hours for little pay, and James dropped out of school at 15 to take a job at a railway yard, loading freight cars, earning enough to keep the family fed. He was strong, quiet, methodical, not given to anger or impulsiveness. He read voraciously, whatever he could borrow from the public library, mostly technical manuals and histories, because he liked understanding how things worked and why events unfolded the way they did. In 1940, a year before Pearl Harbor, he enlisted in the Army, not out of patriotism, but because the pay was better than the railway yard and because he wanted to send money home. He scored high on the marksmanship tests at basic training and was assigned to the infantry. By the time his unit shipped out to the Pacific in early 1943, he was a corporal, a squad leader, and one of the best riflemen in his battalion. The M1 Garand was a standard service rifle of the United States military during World War II, and it was, by most measures, the best infantry rifle in the world at that time. It was a semi-automatic, gas-operated rifle that fired the .30-06 Springfield cartridge from an 8-round and block clip. It was reliable, accurate, and fast. A trained rifleman could fire all 8 rounds in under 10 seconds and reload in under 3. The rifle weighed 9.5 pounds, had an effective range of 500 yards, and could punch through wood, light cover, and human bodies with devastating efficiency. General George S. Patton called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. The Japanese, who were armed primarily with the Type 38 and Type 99 bolt-action rifles, feared it because American soldiers could put out twice the volume of fire in the same amount of time. But the standard .30-06 Springfield round, while effective against personnel in light cover, had limitations. It could not penetrate heavy fortifications. It could not defeat armored vehicles. It could not punch through concrete, thick logs, or steel plating. And as American forces pushed deeper into the Pacific, as the Japanese dug in and fortified their positions, those limitations became a problem. The Japanese defensive strategy in the Pacific evolved significantly between 1942 and 1944. Early in the war, Japanese commanders relied on aggressive counterattacks, banzai charges, and attempts to push American forces back into the sea. These tactics failed repeatedly with catastrophic casualties. By mid-1943, Japanese defensive doctrine had shifted to a strategy of attrition. Instead of charging, they dug in. Instead of fighting on the beaches, they fortified the interior. They built bunkers, pillboxes, and reinforced caves. They used the terrain, the jungle, the coral ridges, and the volcanic rock to create defensive networks that were nearly impossible to assault without taking heavy casualties. These fortifications were not crude. They were engineered, often by experienced engineers and construction units, using reinforced concrete, steel beams, coconut logs, and earth. They were designed to withstand artillery, to provide interlocking fields of fire, to force attackers into kill zones. And they worked. American casualties spiked. Attacks that should have taken hours took days. Positions that should have fallen with a single assault held out for weeks. The problem was not a lack of firepower. American forces had artillery, naval gunfire, air support, tanks, flamethrowers, and demolition charges. But all of these required coordination, time, and often direct line of sight or proximity to the target. A bunker dug into a hillside, concealed by jungle, with a firing slit the size of a shoebox, could hold up an entire company. A single machine gun nest, properly positioned and fortified, could kill dozens of men before it was silenced. And the standard infantry weapon, the M1 Garand, could not solve the problem on its own. A rifleman could shoot at the firing slit all day and not hit anything. A rifleman could fire at the walls and make noise but not penetrate. What was needed was a rifle round that could defeat fortifications, that could punch through logs and steel and concrete, that could turn the M1 Garand from an anti-personnel weapon into an anti-fortification weapon. That round was the M2 armor-piercing high-velocity cartridge. It was not originally designed for the infantry. The M2 armor-piercing round was developed in the late 1930s for use in the M1919 Brown machine gun, primarily as an anti-vehicle and anti-aircraft round. It used a hardened steel penetrator core, a copper jacket, and a larger powder charge than the standard M1 ball round, which increased its muzzle velocity from 2,800 feet per second to just over 3,000 feet per second. The increased velocity, combined with a hardened penetrator, allowed the round to pierce light armor, aircraft fuselages, and vehicle engines. It was not designed for the M1 Garand. The Garand's gas system was tuned for the pressure curve of the standard M1 ball round, and the higher pressure the M2 round could, in theory, cause accelerated wear, damage the operating rod, or even crack the receiver. But in practice, when tested under field conditions in late 1943, the M1 Garand handled the M2 round without significant issues, provided the rifle was properly maintained and the gas cylinder was kept clean. The higher recoil was noticeable, but manageable. The increased noise and muzzle flash gave away the shooter's position more readily, but that was a tactical trade-off, and the penetration was extraordinary. The M2 round could punch through 3/4-inch steel plate at 100 yards. It could penetrate 12 inches of hardwood. It could go through a coconut log bunker and kill the men inside. By early 1944, limited quantities of M2 armor-piercing ammunition were being distributed to frontline infantry units in the Pacific, not as a replacement for standard ammunition, but as a supplement, issued in small quantities for use against fortified positions. McKenna first received M2 rounds during the assault on Saipan in June 1944. Saipan was a critical target, part of the Mariana Islands, 1,500 miles from Tokyo, close enough to serve as a base for B-29 Superfortress bombers. The Japanese knew this, and they fortified the island accordingly. The beaches were mined and covered by artillery. The interior was a network of caves, bunkers, and reinforced positions. The terrain was brutal, volcanic ridges and cane fields and dense jungle. The Japanese garrison numbered over 30,000 men, and they had orders to hold at all costs. The American assault began on June 15, 1944, with a massive naval bombardment followed by amphibious landings. McKenna's unit, part of the 27th Infantry Division, landed on the second day and pushed inland. Progress was slow. Every ridge, every valley, every patch of jungle concealed enemy positions. The Japanese did not retreat. They fought from bunkers and caves, forcing the Americans to clear each position individually, often at close range, often with grenades, flamethrowers, and demolition charges. McKenna's squad lost 3 men in the first week, not to banzai charges or artillery, but to machine gun fire from bunkers they could not suppress. On the morning of June 22nd, McKenna's company was tasked with securing a ridge that overlooked a critical supply route. The ridge was heavily fortified, with at least a dozen bunkers and an unknown number of spider holes. The attack began at dawn with artillery support, but the artillery was ineffective because the bunkers were dug in too deep. The company advanced up the slope, taking fire from multiple positions, and within an hour they were pinned down. McKenna's squad was on the left flank, pressed against a coral outcropping, unable to move forward or back. The bunker that was holding them up was 50 yards upslope, built into the hillside, logs and earth and steel, with a firing slit that covered the entire approach. McKenna tried to suppress it with rifle fire, but the rounds just sparked off the logs. He tried to call for a bazooka team, but they were pinned down elsewhere. He tried to flank the position, but the terrain made it impossible. Then the supply sergeant, a man named Kowalski who had been hauling ammunition up the slope under fire, crawled over with a bandolier of M2 rounds. Kowalski said he had 12 rounds, that they were armor-piercing, that they would go through the bunker if McKenna could hit it. McKenna took the bandolier, loaded his Garand, and aimed. The first shot was an experiment. McKenna aimed at the center log, just left of the firing slit, squeezed the trigger. The recoil was sharper than he expected. The muzzle flashed brighter. The round hit the log and punched through, not cleanly, but went through. McKenna could see the splintered wood, could see daylight on the other side. He fired again, same spot. The second log cracked. He fired a third time, and this time around penetrated all 3 layers and hit something inside the bunker, probably an ammunition crate or grenade, because there was an explosion not large, but enough. Smoke poured from the firing slit. The machine gun went silent. McKenna did not wait. He signaled his squad, and they moved up fast, grenades ready, but when they reached the bunker there was no resistance. The 3 Japanese soldiers inside were dead, killed by the explosion or by shrapnel from the penetrating rounds. McKenna's squad moved past the bunker, cleared 2 spider holes, and pushed to the top of the ridge. By nightfall, the company had secured the position. McKenna's squad suffered no additional casualties. Word of the M2 rounds spread quickly. The tactical impact of armor-piercing ammunition in the M1 Garand was immediate and profound. Riflemen who had been trained to engage personnel targets suddenly had the capability to engage fortifications. A single soldier with a Garand and a handful of M2 rounds could suppress or destroy a bunker without waiting for heavy weapon support. This changed the tempo of infantry assaults. It reduced casualties. It gave squad leaders options they did not have before. If a bunker was holding up an advance, you did not need to call for a tank or a flamethrower or wait for artillery. You could designate your best marksman, give him M2 rounds, and have him punch holes in the bunker until it was no longer a threat. The Japanese, who had invested enormous effort in building fortifications that could withstand artillery and naval gunfire, found that their bunkers were vulnerable to rifle fire. This was demoralizing. It forced changes in defensive tactics. Japanese engineers began to build bunkers with thicker walls, with more layers of logs and earth, with firing slits positioned at angles to make direct shots more difficult. But these adaptations took time and resources, and they were not always effective. The M2 round could penetrate most field fortifications, and even when it did not penetrate completely, the impact often created spalling, where fragments of wood, steel, or concrete were blown off the inside of the wall and became lethal projectiles. The psychological effect on Japanese soldiers was significant. The name Heki no Toppa, wall breaker, appeared in intercepted communications and captured documents within weeks of the M2 round being used on Saipan. Japanese soldiers reported that American riflemen were using a new type of ammunition that could punch through bunkers, that nowhere was safe, that the fortifications they had built were no longer adequate. One captured diary, translated by American intelligence, described an attack in late June 1944 in which a bunker that had survived 2 days of artillery fire was destroyed in minutes by rifle fire. The diary entry noted that the walls simply disintegrated, that the rounds came to the logs like they were paper, and that the men inside had no chance. The diarist, a private named Yamamoto, concluded that the Americans had developed a demon weapon, and that the only defense was to dig deeper or to avoid bunkers altogether and fight from caves. This shift in Japanese defensive thinking had strategic implications. Caves were harder to build, and harder to supply than bunkers. Caves limited mobility and made it difficult to provide mutual support between positions. And caves, while resistant to rifle fire, were vulnerable to flamethrowers, demolition charges, and being sealed shut. The shift from bunkers to caves, driven in part by fear of the wall breaker, made Japanese defenses more brittle and easier to reduce once American forces developed the tactics to exploit the weaknesses. The technical characteristics of the M2 armor-piercing round made it both effective and challenging to use. The round was longer and heavier than the standard M1 ball round, weighing 174 grains compared to 150 grains. An increased powder charge generated approximately 15% more chamber pressure. This higher pressure increased the stress on the Garand's operating system, particularly the gas cylinder and the operating rod. In rifles that were well maintained, this was not a problem. But in rifles that had accumulated carbon buildup in the gas cylinder or that had worn or damaged parts, the increased pressure could cause malfunctions. The most common issue was a failure to extract, where the spent casing remained stuck in the chamber because the extractor claw could not overcome the increased friction. The second most common issue was a bent operating rod, caused by the higher pressure forcing the rod to cycle faster and harder than it was designed to handle. To mitigate these issues, armorers and squad leaders were instructed to ensure that rifles firing M2 rounds were cleaned more frequently, that gas cylinders were inspected and cleared of carbon buildup, and that operating rods were checked for signs of stress or deformation. In practice, this meant that the best-maintained rifles were given the M2 rounds, and the riflemen with the best shooting skills were assigned to use them. McKenna became one of those designated marksmen. His Garand was meticulously maintained, cleaned every night, inspected every morning. He kept a small notebook in which he recorded every malfunction, every jam, every unusual behavior, and he adjusted his maintenance routine accordingly. He learned to recognize the signs of an overheated gas cylinder, the feel of a round that did not seat properly, the sound of an extractor that was starting to wear. He learned to pace his shots when using M2 rounds to allow the rifle time to cool between engagements, to avoid rapid fire that could overheat the barrel or damage the gas system. And he learned to aim for the weakest points in a fortification, the joints between logs, the edges of steel plates, the areas where the structure was most likely to fail under penetration. His squad came to rely on him. When they encountered a bunker, they looked to McKenna. When they needed a firing slit suppressed or a wall breached, McKenna was the one who did it. He did not think of himself as special. He was just doing his job, using the tools he had been given, trying to keep his men alive. The M2 round was not a perfect solution. It had limitations. The increased recoil made rapid follow-up shots more difficult. The louder report and larger muzzle flash made the shooter more visible to enemy observers and snipers. The round was less effective against reinforced concrete, which required either repeated hits in the same spot or the use of heavier weapons. And the supply of M2 rounds was limited. They were not produced in the same quantities as standard ball ammunition, and they were not always available when and where they were needed. Units that received M2 rounds often rationed them, issuing them only to designated marksmen, saving them for critical engagements. McKenna typically carried no more than 24 M2 rounds at a time, 3 8-round clips, mixed in with his standard ammunition. He used them sparingly, only when a target warranted it, only when standard rounds would not suffice. This discipline was common among riflemen who used M2 rounds. They understood that the ammunition was valuable, that wasting it on targets that could be engaged with standard rounds was foolish. They understood that the M2 round was a tool for specific situations, not a replacement for standard tactics. The evolution of American infantry tactics in the Pacific was driven by innovations like the M2 armor-piercing round, but also by the harsh lessons of combat. By mid-1944, American commanders had developed a doctrine for reducing fortified positions that combined fire and maneuver with specialized weapons and coordinated support. The standard procedure was to identify the fortification, suppress it with rifle and machine gun fire, maneuver a flanking element into position, and then assault with grenades, flamethrowers, or demolition charges. The M2 round fit into this doctrine as a suppression and breaching tool. While the flanking element was moving, a rifleman with M2 rounds would engage the bunker, punching holes in the walls, forcing defenders to take cover, disrupting their ability to fire effectively. This gave the assault element time to close the distance and finish the job. The tactic was not foolproof. It required coordination, timing, and often a degree of luck. But it worked more often than it failed, and it reduced casualties compared to frontal assaults without suppression. One of the most effective uses of M2 ammunition came during the Battle of Peleliu in September and October 1944. Peleliu was a small island in the Palau chain, heavily fortified by the Japanese, with over 500 caves and bunkers connected by tunnels. The Japanese commander, Colonel Kunio Nakagawa, had abandoned the doctrine of beach defense and banzai charges in favor of a defensive strategy based on attrition. His men were dug into the coral ridges, into positions that were nearly impervious to artillery and air strikes, and they had orders to hold out as long as possible, to kill as many Americans as possible, to make the invasion so costly that it would give the Japanese leverage in future negotiations. The American assault began on September 15, 1944, and what was supposed to be a 3-day operation turned into a 2-month nightmare. The 1st Marine Division, which led the assault, suffered over 60% casualties. The fighting was brutal, close range, often hand-to-hand. Every cave had to be cleared. Every bunker had to be reduced. And the M2 armor-piercing round became one of the most valuable tools the Marines had. Marines armed with M1 Garands and M2 rounds worked in teams with flamethrower operators and demolition engineers. The riflemen would engage the bunker or cave entrance, firing M2 rounds into the firing slits or into the walls, forcing the defenders to take cover or move deeper into the position. The flamethrower operator would then move forward and spray burning fuel into the entrance, either killing the defenders outright or forcing them to retreat further. The demolition engineer would follow up with satchel charges or explosives, sealing the entrance or collapsing the structure. This 3-part tactic, refined through trial and error over the course of the Peleliu campaign, became standard procedure for reducing fortifications in the Pacific. The M2 round was critical because it allowed the rifleman to engage the target from a distance, without exposing himself to direct fire, and because it created an immediate suppressive effect that made the subsequent assault less dangerous. McKenna fought on Peleliu. His unit, now part of the 81st Infantry Division, was brought in as reinforcement in late September after Marines had suffered catastrophic casualties. McKenna's company was assigned to clear a section of the Merbegal Ridge, a jagged coral formation honeycombed with caves and bunkers that the Marines had been unable to reduce. The ridge was a death trap. The coral was sharp enough to shred uniforms and cut through boots. The heat was unbearable, over 100 degrees during the day, with no shade and no water except what you carried. The Japanese defenders were invisible, firing from concealed positions, then disappearing into the tunnels before you could return fire. McKenna's company spent 3 weeks on the ridge, advancing a few yards at a time, clearing one position after another. McKenna used M2 rounds constantly, firing into cave entrances, into bunker walls, into any opening that might conceal a defender. He learned to judge the thickness of a wall by the sound a round made when it hit, a dull thud for thick coral, a sharp crack for thinner material. He learned to aim for the edges of firing slits, where the structure was weakest. He learned to fire multiple rounds into the same spot, creating a breach that could be exploited by grenades or demolition charges. He kept a tally in his notebook. 47 bunkers and caves engaged, 31 confirmed destroyed or neutralized, 16 probables. His squad suffered for casualties during those 3 weeks, all wounded, none killed. Other squads without M2 rounds suffered far worse. The strategic impact of the M2 armor-piercing round extended beyond individual battles. It influenced American weapons development and doctrine for the remainder of the war and into the post-war period. The success of the M2 round and the M1 Garand demonstrated that infantry rifles could be effective against fortifications if given the right ammunition, and this led to research into other specialized rounds, including incendiary, tracer, and frangible rounds. It also influenced the design of the next generation of American infantry rifles. The M14, which replaced the M1 Garand in the 1950s, was designed from the outset to handle a variety of ammunition types, including armor-piercing rounds, and its gas system was engineered to tolerate higher chamber pressures. The concept of the designated marksman, a a rifleman equipped with specialized ammunition and tasked with engaging specific high-value targets, became a formal part of American infantry doctrine and remains so to this day. The M2 round and the tactics developed around it laid the groundwork for modern infantry marksmanship programs and the role of precision fire in combined arms operations. The human cost of the Pacific War was staggering. Over 100,000 American soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines were killed in action. Over 300,000 were wounded. Japanese casualties were far higher, with over 2 million military deaths and hundreds of thousands of civilian deaths. The war in the Pacific was characterized by its brutality, by the refusal of either side to surrender, by the willingness to fight to the last man. It was a war in which ordinary soldiers, men like James McKenna, were forced to confront extraordinary challenges, to adapt, to innovate, to survive. The M2 armor-piercing round was one small innovation among many, a technical solution to a tactical problem. But for the men who used it, it was the difference between life and death. It gave them a tool to fight back, to overcome defenses that had seemed insurmountable, to take the offensive when doctrine said they should wait for support. And it gave them a small measure of control in a war that was defined by chaos and randomness. McKenna survived the war. He fought on Pillbox on Okinawa and was part of the occupation force in Japan after the surrender. He was promoted to sergeant, awarded the Bronze Star for actions on Pillbox, and discharged in 1946. He returned to Pittsburgh, married a woman he had known since childhood, and took a job as a machinist at a factory that made industrial equipment. He rarely spoke about the war. When he did, he talked about the men he had served with, the friends he had lost, the exhaustion and fear and long stretches of boredom punctuated by moments of terror. He did not talk about the M2 rounds, about the bunkers, about the men he had killed. He did not need to. The war had been full of terrible necessities, and that was just one of them. He kept his service records, his Bronze Star citation, and a faded photograph of his squad taken on Saipan in July 1944. In the photograph, he is standing in the front row, rifle slung over his shoulder, looking directly at the camera with an expression that is neither proud nor ashamed, just tired. He died in 2003 at the age of 82. His obituary mentioned his service, his family, his 40 years at the factory. It did not mention the wall breaker. The M2 armor-piercing round was eventually replaced by newer ammunition types as rifle technology advanced, but its legacy persists. Modern infantry rifles are capable of firing a wide range of specialized ammunition, from armor-piercing to incendiary to frangible, and the concept of tailoring ammunition to the tactical situation is now a fundamental principle of infantry operations. The M1 Garand itself is no longer in service, replaced by the M14, the M16, and now the M4, but remains one of the most iconic rifles in American military history, remembered for its reliability, its accuracy, and its role in winning World War II. And among the men who carried it, among the veterans who used M2 rounds to breach bunkers and save lives, it is remembered for something more, for being a tool that gave ordinary soldiers the ability to do extraordinary things, to overcome obstacles that should have been insurmountable, to fight and win against an enemy that had every advantage except one, which was the ingenuity and determination of the men who carried that rifle into battle. The story of the M2 armor-piercing round and the M1 Garand is not a story that appears in most history books. It is a footnote, a technical detail, a minor innovation in a war full of innovations. But for the men who use it, for the men like James McKenna who crouched behind coral outcroppings and aimed at bunkers and fired rounds that punched through walls and saved lives, it was not minor, it was critical. It was a difference between success and failure, between life and death. It was proof that war is not just about grand strategy and logistics and firepower, but about the small, brutal details, the individual decisions, the moment when a soldier looks at an impossible problem and figures out how to solve it with the tools at hand. That is the real story of the wall breaker. It is not a story about technology. It is a story about the men who used that technology, who adapted it, who made it work in situations it was never designed for, who survived because they were resourceful and skilled and determined. It is a story that deserved to be told, even if the men who lived it chose not to tell it themselves. Where are you watching this story from? Comment below. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Let's keep their memory alive together.